Hello and welcome. I'm the Artistic Director for the Queer Arts Festival. And I have a whole sheet of things that I'm supposed to be telling you. I'm going to start with that this festival takes place on the unceded territory of the Coast Salish people, especially the Musqueam, the Tsleil-Waututh, and the Squamish. And I was recently reminded that we say this a lot in Vancouver now, and then we just carry on. And there seems to be deafening silence. It's just something we say in the beginning of the show. So I wanted us just to stop for a moment and think about that. Not many of you here know me very well. But I'm just going to tell you this regarding that. And as long ago as 30 years ago, when I first heard Midnight Oil burning beds about giving it back, that's my belief that we should give this land back. So we recognize their sovereignty, as there are no treaties on this land. And QAF is actively dedicated in forging new relationships, nation to nation, based on truth, respect, and consent. We're working on protocols with the nations, and we hope to have that in place by next year. I'm supposed to tell you to take out your cell phones and turn them off, and to thank the wonderful people at the Roundhouse, and to look at the back of your programs and support all the people that support us, and to thank the volunteers and the sponsors, and to tell you that afterwards, at any time during the festival, to please go down to the wine bar, which is in Provence at the foot of Davie, and bring your ticket stubs and put them in the raffle and say you're here with the Queer Arts Festival. At 10 o'clock they have 25% off Appies, and we always go out and hang out there. And to support the people that support us. I especially want to thank the McGrain and Pearson Foundation, who are offering a cash up to $5,000 matching fund, and just how much I appreciate that, and to let you know that. And I'm supposed to be asking you for money. That's what my job is here when I'm up here. And I'm not going to do that tonight. Instead, I want to talk about why the festival is dedicated to Orlando this year. It's been in the news a lot, and recently I was just talking with the Frank Theater, who's doing Pink Line, if you look in your programs in the next couple of days. And I said it's especially important to be doing something around racism and activism, considering what happened. And he said, yeah, I don't want to use that. And it really got me thinking a lot and crunching around in my mind about that, because that's not what we want to do. That's not why we're doing that. We're doing it because 50 of our people were murdered and another 50 injured, and that it's not an unusual thing, actually, maybe in that huge amount at one time, but that brown queers and black queers and indigenous queers, and especially trans women, queers of every color other than white, are killed and chased and spat upon. And you know all these things, but it's important for us to acknowledge that again. And especially I wanted to talk about it because tomorrow we have a song launch, Breaking Barriers, at 2 p.m. And one of the people in that show has told us that he's from Florida, and 2 of his friends died that night. And how important and how grateful he is that we acknowledge that here in Canada, in another country, across a half a continent, that we're thinking of them, and that even though our queer families are far-flung across the whole world in every culture, that we are community and that we're all feeling it, and everywhere I think people are making this kind of dedication, and hopefully it's not I wrote a billion things, which none of them I'm looking at. Really, I take a long time to think about these things. It takes me days to figure out what I'm going to write and what I'm going to say, and still it doesn't really always come out right. But I just wanted to mark that, and I see a lot of us, I see us over these days huddled in groups, and I think crying and talking and talking about things like, should I take my pride flag down? Should I take those stickers off my car? And it's really important that we don't, because silence equals death. The other thing I'm supposed to do is introduce the lovely people that you're about to hear, Lyle Chan. I talked to Lyle Chan. I told him I'm going to let you introduce yourself. We talked about what I wanted to say, and he's going to do a really wonderful job of introducing him, and I wanted to say how pleased I am that he's here and how these things connect and how that they're still killing us. And it's sad that we live in a false paradise, but I'm so glad that we're all here tonight and just be fabulous and queer and alive. Thank you very much.
The first thing I want to do is say thank you to SD and to Elliot and Rachel and everybody else in this valiant Queer Arts Festival for bringing us here from Australia. It's very, very special to be here for a couple of reasons. One is that this work has never been done in North America before. It's only been performed in Australia. The other is that this is actually the first time, can you believe it, that we're performing in front of a specifically queer audience. The other performances have been to normal concert series. Once we performed to a radio audience, which was a very, very full house because the radio audience brought a whole bunch of people who normally just listened to Mozart and Beethoven. They had to be confronted with music that was written in response to a terrible, terrible time. And so it's very, very special for us to be here to play this work for you. This work, in a way, is it probably shouldn't have been written in a way. I only wrote it because I saw the story had a happy ending. AIDS needn't have had a happy ending. The plague years leading up to the miracle drugs in 1996 were so terrible that they should be forgotten. Except that what happened was that the valiant heroes who banded together to do something about it won. This is what happens when people come together and put things at risk, decide there's something they want, and they get it. We had a happy ending, which was kind of unexpected. And so, I was saying the other night to an audience here that I don't believe in sad stories. If the AIDS crisis did not have a happy ending, I wouldn't be interested in writing a piece of music and showing it to you and telling you about it. But what happened was that we had a miracle ending where, in the first world at least, AIDS is no longer a crisis. I know we still have AIDS in the first world. I know that AIDS is an expanding epidemic in Asia and in Africa. But to honor the people who are no longer with us in the 1980s, in 1990s, we have to say that that moment, that terrible moment, no longer is with us. So my story as an AIDS activist began when I was still living in Madison, Wisconsin. My first boyfriend was HIV positive. I think mine would be considered the first generation of gay men who never knew a time before AIDS. So in your coming of age, in your coming out, you already knew about AIDS. You know, in any contemplation of sexual activity, this was in the background. And so I kind of had a choice, you know, do nothing, join the innocent bystanders. You know, there were a lot of people who did nothing, or see what would happen if you tried to do something. So I helped found the Madison chapter of ACT UP. Soon after that, I had reason to come to Australia to see my parents. And when I arrived in Australia, I saw that my new friends had AIDS too, and it really, really hit home that this really was an international epidemic. The first piece you're about to hear is called "In September, the Light Changes." And it was written both in Madison as well as in Australia. And you will hear the sound of fluids, I guess, to begin with. You will sound the sound of mists and foghorns and light rain. And it gives way to a churning melody, a melody that you will recognize. It was the melody that the great poet Robert Burns had in mind when he wrote his great poem about friendship, Auld Lang Syne. So, you know, friendships should be allowed to grow old, but at that time, maybe not. The organization that I did most of my activism with was ACT UP, the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power. Its most famous chapter, of course, is the New York chapter. But because of the crisis, was because it was international. Chapters sprang up in all major cities around the world. I know you had one in Vancouver. In many ways, what I'm telling you tonight will sound like a parallel universe, because many of the events will be identical. It would just involve different people, but the situation was the same. The issues that ACT UP fought against were discrimination especially in access to treatments itself, because the drugs just weren't working. Many of the protests were very, very colorful. ACT UP was one of the first truly theatrical protest groups that took on the language of advertising and made a great media impact because of it. The people in ACT UP came from all walks of life. So we had, Wall Street bond traders who had given up their jobs to be activists. We had musicians who stopped being artists to be activists. My first protest in ACT UP Sydney involved invading the health department. We walked in with flowers to give to the receptionist and said, "You may go home now. We're taking over the communications for the building." And so then we started to answer all the phone calls that came in for the next hour or so and said, "Yes, hello, I know who you want to speak to, but first of all, we'd like you to know that we're from ACT UP and we want to tell you about the AIDS crisis and what you could do to help end it." Similarly, we would stop traffic on the street with our protests, so we would just sit down in traffic or have a parade with placards in traffic. And then we would have these leaflets that we give to the drivers and say, "Can you give this to your boss and tell your boss this is why you're late for work today?" Because there were people with AIDS on the streets asking for medication. One of the most memorable protests, or certainly the one that got the most media attention, was when a bunch of activists abseiled into Parliament House in the capital of Australia, Canberra. While they were disrupting business as usual in Parliament, there were other activists outside the very, very iconic building of Parliament House and let off orange distress flares, the same flares you would see, in ships. That was to draw attention to the fact that there were actually drugs being approved in other countries that were unavailable in Australia. So one of the main issues for people with HIV in Australia was the slow regulatory system approval for the drugs. So there were drugs available in the United States, for example, that just took too long to be approved in Australia. The reason was that Australia had this regulation system that said, first of all, we must protect our people, our citizens, our patients from harmful side effects. Now, you must remember that the identification of that terrible drug thalidomide as having side effects, it was identified in Australia. So the Australian regulatory system is especially rigorous. And so it treated drugs for dandruff the same way it would treat drugs for cancer or any other life-threatening illness. So it wouldn't recognize that you would have, you had the right to a greater degree of risk if you had a life-threatening illness to try an experimental therapy when other therapies weren't working. That was one of the main things that ACT UP was working to change. And it took many years to do that, but it did work, and through protests like the ones I described. Being an ACT UP was completely exhilarating. We weren't sure if we were accomplishing anything for many, many years. But it was fun doing things like, giving out the fax numbers for recalcitrant politicians, so that the community would send faxes. And do you guys know what a fax is? Some of you So we would encourage that they would send reams of black paper through the fax, so the fax machine would jam. So all the music I wrote, all the music I sketched during the time that I was an actor that led to the pieces you're hearing tonight, they're all infused with some really desperate as well as exciting qualities. So it all has a heightened sense of emotion. One of the things I did in Sydney was to import illegal medications into Australia. I ran the Buyers Club in Sydney, and this is a phenomenon, again, that happened in a lot of major cities where people got together to get the medication that they needed that they couldn't get from, your corner pharmacy or your doctor. In the early years of the epidemic, there were a lot of medications that were touted to be effective against HIV. None of them were. But what happened was it set up the system. The people who ran the drugs through borders, from China or Mexico, got the system in place to run drugs. And so what happened later on in the early 1990s was a drug came along. It was called DDC. It was a proper pharmaceutical medication made by a proper drug company. But unlike a lot of the other drugs like AZT, it was actually relatively simple to make, illicitly. So my friend Jim Cordy in Los Angeles started to set up laboratories to create bootleg versions of DDC, and started to supply buyers clubs like mine, like others around the United States. Everybody thought that he was merely the purveyor. You know, he would source it somewhere and he would be the middle person selling it. But very few people knew that he actually made it. Jim was an extraordinary person. He was a nurse. He lost his partner to AIDS, and he teamed up with the famous Martin Delaney of Project Inform to create an organization about giving information to people with HIV, as well as trying to smuggle drugs across countries. I thought of my friend Jim as a shaman. You know, he was able to make medication out of thin air. I thought he was a magician. He had to move his lab around many times to stop to not be caught, because the authorities were onto him a few times. One time, in fact, the New York Times wrote an article about him as a person who was an active smuggler of medication. And this person who wrote, this journalist who wrote the article, knew that Jim was actually the manufacturer, but fell short of saying that in the article, because the journalist herself knew that if she named him as the manufacturer of DDC, thousands of people would be denied access to the medication. So this piece you're about to hear, the first section is a rain dance in honor of the man I consider a shaman. This was a man who could make rain. However, when the rain comes, you'll hear that's just a little of it. protests I took part in with ACTA were in the area of treatment access, because that was my specialty. But there was one time when I took part in a different kind of protest, because I thought it was important. There was a politician in Australia, her name was Franca Arena, and she wanted to start up this compensation campaign, compensation for so-called innocent victims of AIDS. So she wanted to have the government give money to people who got AIDS from medical procedures or blood transfusions and so on, and specifically exclude people who got HIV infection from sex or needle exchange or something like that, use of needles. And ACTA thought this was intolerable. Personally, I felt it was important because if there was money at all in the government, it should be put into treatment research. We didn't have drugs that worked. The drugs were meager. The drugs, sometimes worked. They worked in a limited way. Research was the most important thing. And I think I was being controversial by saying that if you give money to a person so that their deaths were more comfortable, they were going to die anyway. I understand why you want to do that, but what you're doing is saying, let's make the deaths of some people comfortable and completely ignore another entire class of people. So I took part in this protest because I thought it was a very important issue that was difficult to get across. And so I took part in the protest that I was disguised as a journalist. I got media accreditation from some unsuspected newspaper, and I got into Parliament House. And so, in fact, there were actually two groups of activists. One got in and started to right away put up placards about the issue. And as expected, they were ejected right away. Then there was a second team that was left, and I was in the second team. I actually gave testimony. So I actually, sorry, I should have said that at this parliamentary hearing, it was actually a public hearing about this issue. And so I was one of the activists who spoke to give testimony about why we thought such a campaign, such a compensation scheme should not be set up. At the end of giving the testimony, I happened to find myself right next to this politician, Franca Arena. And so I started speaking directly to her, and I told her what was on my mind. And she freaked out, and she started to move away from me, and I followed her, and I spoke louder and louder, and it was all caught on TV cameras. And as she was turning away from me, I noticed there was this sadness and fear and something else in her eyes, I couldn't quite forget. And later on, I found out what it was. She had twin sons who were gay. So she wanted to set up this campaign, and she had twin sons who were gay. She was deeply, deeply religious. And I understood that she had this internal conflict inside of her. She loved her sons, but she hated the fact that they were gay. So she tried to do something as a politician so that she was doing something about AIDS, which was an issue that affected her sons. And yet she needed to make sure that people like her sons could not benefit from it. It was very, very complicated. But when I realized that was what was going on, I was ambushed by an emotion I wasn't expecting. I had all this anger against the idea, and yet I was ambushed by this compassion, because I kind of got it. I kind of got that she was conflicted, and she was doing her best to claw her way out of having this, irreconcilable two sides to her issue. And so I'm happy to report that in time, she and her sons have reconciled. The compensation scheme did not go ahead in the format that she wanted. There was a very, very terse moment when she was so estranged from her sons. One time they failed to show up for a Christmas dinner, and she was so upset that she tried to commit suicide, but her husband anticipated it and rescued her. And as I said, it did have a happy ending because they have reconciled. The music that I wrote at that time is in 3 sections. The first section is actually, I suppose, kind of like the music I would have written if the AIDS crisis hadn't happened. It's this vulnerable, slightly shy music that is like me. The middle section is very rigorous music. It's kind of inspired by the music I was listening to from Bruce Springsteen, who was a very, very committed activist. And the last section was written out of this ambush feeling of compassion that I felt for Frank Irene and the twin sons. In fact, the music was written while I was thinking of how I was so glad that her twin boys had each other when they didn't have their mother. And so there's a beautiful melody for the two violins, one finishing off the other's melody, just like twins who would finish off each other's sentences. get DDC shipped out of Los Angeles to Australia when LA was seized by the Rodney King riots. Jim Cordy was trying to get the drug onto a Federal Express courier for me. And he had to call me and said, look, I just can't get anywhere. He was making desperate U-turns just to avoid roadblocks and cars on fire. And he got home and he gave me a call and I said, I think you should just leave town and just wait it out. He was a white man living in a predominantly black neighborhood, which he loved, but it was a very, very dangerous time. And I said, we'll deal with this when the crisis is over. All the while thinking, what if it's never over? What if it's always going to be like this? It was a very, very timely reminder that for all the problems facing people with AIDS, there were other problems in the world. Other problems from the same issues, like discrimination. One of the reasons that people with AIDS had so much trouble getting access to medication was because the medical system didn't think they were important enough. And so this next piece you will hear is the most abstract piece you'll hear tonight. It was written while I was thinking of these chemicals that were trying to get their way, all across the oceans to Australia, thinking of how they didn't care. They had their regal chemical properties, they were abstract, they were powerful, kind of regardless of what human beings did to each other. My friend Bruce Brown was the most prominent active activist. He was one of the frankest people I knew. friends would become enemies and enemies would become friends depending on whether you agreed with him on any of the important issues, all of the AIDS issues. He used to say, if we offended you, you needed it. Bruce was a very, very fine harpsichordist and organist. He was one of the founders of Philharmonic Baroque in San Francisco, and he was partly responsible for introducing Nicholas McGavin to the ensemble, and he's still their artistic director. Bruce was very, very inspiring because he would take no prisoners. He gave up his job to be a full-time activist. He was the poster boy. He was the most charismatic of all of us. He would speak very, very well in public. And as a result of a lot of people hearing Bruce speak about the desperation of the times, people became activists. So he was a great, great leader in that way. Privately, he loved his music. One of his favorites was Blossom Dearie. And so in making a musical portrait about him, I decided to make it sound as sophisticated and as mundane as I could make it. So I hope you enjoy this portrait of Bruce. been a full-time activist for 4 years, which is quite amazing. He had given up his full-time job, as a musicologist for the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, because it was too demanding on him, so that he could take on an even more demanding job as a full-time activist. Bruce had a rule. He said that if at any point the quality of his life dropped below a certain level, there would be no point having more quantity of life. And it was a question that faced anybody with late-stage AIDS. For him, it had to do with his eyesight. He said that if he ever lost his eyesight, there would be no point living. Now, Bruce this was real for him. He had an infection called cytomegalovirus, which was an infection that caused blindness eventually. It was sort of treatable, not permanently treatable for people with AIDS, but manageable sometimes, using a very, very toxic drug that had a lot of side effects. And the treatment made you hospital-bound or house-bound at best, and your quality of life would be very, very low. Bruce, being one of the bravest men that I ever have met, he opted for a brand new way of treating the CMV infection, which was a direct injection into the eye. He was one of the very, very first people in the world to say yes to the experiment. Of course, it did work because it was a very good drug. By doing that, you would avoid a lot of the toxic side effects in the rest of your body, your liver, your kidneys. I remember one time we were preparing to go to the International AIDS Conference in Berlin. And of course, it was a brand new procedure, and very few people knew about it. He made me sit in with this nurse, as the nurse injected his eye, and said, "We're going to Berlin, you gotta watch, because you're gonna be doing it if we can't find somebody to do it." So it was a joke, but jokes back in those days were always, there was a, you never know behind it. At some point, of course, the drug stopped working, and Bruce was losing his eyesight. And so he decided he would take his own life. He wanted control of everything in his life, including the very end, and the method by which he would end his life. So he decided on a date. He wanted 3 people with him when he did it. I was one of them. The other 2 were also active activists. He had somehow arranged, those of you who know of people who have done the same thing will know how it was done. He had arranged for an overdose of barbiturates. So on that night, he took us into this room, one by one, to say goodbye. I remember he gave me his watch as a gift. He said, "I wanted you to have this." He gave everybody a gift. Somehow that watch has disappeared, by the way. One day I just couldn't find it. I think Bruce took it back. But yes, he said goodbye to us one by one. And by law, of course, I couldn't be in the room when he took the overdose. But the law's an ass. So I was in the room. And he swallowed the barbiturates, and he said, and he gagged, and he said, "Please God, don't let me throw up." And that was the only time that I knew that Bruce believed in God. I didn't know before. So then we said our goodbyes, and we went to the next room, the living room, and we waited through the night. And in the morning, when the sun came out, I decided to go into the room, and Bruce was still sitting up. But I touched him, and he was cold, and he was stiff. And the degree of stiffness was a relief to me, because it showed me that the barbiturates had worked quite well, because it takes a while for the rigor to set in. And so we called the police and the ambulance, and they came. I wrote this piece thinking of the vigil of the night. Bruce loved the music of Bach. Now, when Bach was at the very end of his life, he was going blind himself. And what he wanted to take a piece of music he had written when he was young, full of the frivolities of youth, and he wanted to tidy it up, brush away all the things that were extraneous, and present a new version of the piece. That's what Bach did in his dying days. And so I knew this piece, and I took this piece because it was, they were both organists, they were both going blind. I took this piece and listened to it and watched it alter as I listened to it. And so it became a new piece altogether, and you will still hear the inspirational part, and you will hear what it became. You will hear the special homage to Bruce when activists died. We salute them. We salute them with whistles, because whistles were what we used on the streets to make ourselves sound bigger than we actually were. died, we had lots of things to do. You know, pack up his belongings, divide up the phone list to call people. I remember Kirsty, one of the other two who were in the room with me. Kirsty drew the short straw and calling Bruce's lover in every moment. I got to call his old harpsichord teacher, Lorette Goldberg, in San Francisco. And I said to her, "We're sending you all these things, you know, the music that he wanted to have." And she said, "It's going to go in my library." She ran a very famous library, the Resource Center. And she said, "I'm going to put in a special section with a photo of Bruce." As I was packing, I came across a recording of the Four Last Songs by Strauss. I was 26, I didn't know what they were. But for some reason, I put them on the CD. It was the legendary Jesse Norman recording, then already, I think, several years old and quite famous. And I played it over and over again as I packed. I didn't know what a German back then. But somehow I knew that the songs were about falling asleep. So after Bruce died, lots of things in my life changed. My boyfriend Tom and I broke up. Jim Cordy had become so famous as a drug runner, infamous as a drug runner, that he had to move to Thailand to continue the business. And he said to me, "Why did you come join me in Thailand?" And I didn't, but he ran a bar for a while there. I took some musicology classes at the City Conservatorium. Jim said to me, "That's all comic relief for what it is that we're really doing." So this next piece that you will hear is the music that I wrote immediately after packing Bruce's stuff. And so the influence of the Four Last Songs is audible. And then thinking about Jim and the fact that he was moving to Thailand, even though I knew in my heart he wanted to be in France. He was a great biker, and he was a big fan of the Tour de France, and he would have given anything to just, you know, hang out in the Alps. And so some of the music you will hear will reflect that gorgeous, spacious sound of the French Alps. These next two pieces are a portrait of my friend Tony Cotton, who was an active activist with us. He was the most fun of all of us, the one with the best sense of humor. He was a trained actor. He was Australian, moved to New York, and was on the brink of a major acting career when a friend in Australia became ill and he came back to look after him, and he joined ACT UP. All of ACT UP's protests had a theatrical flair anyway, but he brought something that only a professional entertainer could. So one time, to protest the lack of AIDS beds in the major hospital in Sydney, St. Vincent's Hospital, he set up an AIDS ward on the front lawn of the health minister. So it had nurses and trolley beds and IV drips and all that. And one thing to remember about ACT UP is that we were highly trained because we had members who were lawyers, members of the media. We received training in civil disobedience from the Wilderness Society, so we knew what to do when we got arrested and how to lock up arms. So we had to be dragged off, 10 at a time, which made for great TV. Because what we wanted to do was draw attention to the issues of AIDS. So during that protest, I remember I was the media liaison. I didn't know anything about speaking to the media, so we were trained. There were journalists who trained us. This is what you say. This is how you keep what you say to 10 seconds, otherwise they won't air it. Tony's and my public persona were what most people saw, but I really wanted to remember his sensitive side. The way he would care for his Bichon Frise dog, whom he named Biche. And it was always pronounced like a pun. And he would carry this dog with him everywhere. And the way he would give me surprise gifts and cards to sustain our morale. My last memory of Tony is playing the music, playing the organ at his funeral. And so in the last section of what you're about to hear is a soaring chorale melody, which is how I want to remember him, soaring. Tony wasn't a professional artist, he was an actor, but he did make one piece of artwork, and it was very, very striking. Oftentimes when non-professionals decide to do something, they do it with such originality, it's so striking. He made a piece of art for an exhibition, and the piece of art was called Warrior Blood. It was simply blood swatches, cloth swatches, stained with the blood of people that he considered heroes in the war against AIDS. So he went to all the people that he considered heroes and he said, "Can I prick your finger and have a bit of your blood?" and stained the swatch with it. And then he turned them into panels. And of course, they all looked the same. There was HIV positive, HIV negative blood on it, and it looked identical. It looked like, a Warhol repetitive pattern. And it was entered into an exhibition called Don't Leave Me This Way. And it was the piece that got the most comments, which is pretty amazing. By 1994, the issues of AIDS were so complicated, the treatment issues of AIDS were so complicated that some of the things that ACT UP was most suited for no longer worked. We were best at things that were made up of sound bites. You could actually hold up a placard that said, "Release the drugs now," or "AIDS treatments now." But issues have become so complicated. We had access to quite a few drugs by that point, but they weren't working. What we needed was drugs that were in the, we had emptied the pipeline, and the drugs weren't working. What we needed to do was get into the earlier part of the pipeline, cooperate with pharmaceutical companies when they were developing drugs in the test tube stage. The good thing about ACT UP, of course, was that it was made up of people who knew how to negotiate behind the scenes. A splinter group split off from ACT UP. I was part of it. It was called AIDS X. And this, again, is in parallel to the stories in a lot of other cities. In New York, the Treatment Action Group came out of ACT UP as a specialist group that intervened with pharmaceutical researchers and medical researchers at a very early stage to say, "Show us the data. We know how to read medical data. We will help you figure out which drugs to test with us. We'll do you a deal. You give us the drugs, early access to drugs. We give you the data from our bodies so that you could get marketing approval for it and make a profit from it." That sort of thing was not suited to the mass media. That sort of thing was very much behind the scenes negotiating at tables. So AIDS was actually a guerrilla medical group. We ran our own underground medical trials. Again, other cities did the same thing. It was surreptitious in that in order to get the medications that we needed to run the trials, we told lies. So we went to hospitals and drug companies and left out information about our patients as to what they were on, because it was a very, very conservative regime. In order for the drug approval authority to approve the drugs, you needed to prove that your drug was better than all the others, and to have the data be pure, we can only take that drug, not the others. Well, what kind of world is that? The world is made up of drug cocktails when people have effective medication. So we lied, got the drugs, ran our own trials, at some point published the data after the dust settled. One of our patients was the famous Australian artist David McDermott. He was very, very famous in the gay community because his work was used to publicize a safe-sex campaign very early on in the epidemic. His work was very, very sardonic, almost a twisted sense of humor. Once when one of his best friends died, he put an ad in the paper, piece of artwork as an ad, and the ad said, "Moody bitch dies of AIDS." He would have artwork that said, "I want a future that lives up to my past," or another one that says, "It's my party, I'll die if I want to." David was also very, very difficult. He had seen so many of his friends die from being treated because of the side effects, because the side effects of some of these very toxic drugs were severe. And so there came a time when David needed a drug called, he had a very severe fungal infection. And he needed to be treated with a drug called amphotericin, which we knew would work. We also knew it was very, very toxic. And David had seen a friend on amphotericin suffer. And David said, no, I'm not taking that drug. Find me a better solution. So we, the ASX team, had to find him a solution, which was pretty incredible. You know, the fact that this patient just refused to take his medication and said there must be a better way. So this was pre-internet, 1994 it was. I had heard that somewhere in England there was a hospital that had a way of using a fat mixed with amphotericin, and it somehow reduced the side effects. So being pre-internet, all I had was my phone, so I started calling England randomly. Literally, I called the most famous hospital in London, and they said, no, we think somebody in Brighton is doing that. So I called the Brighton hospital, and the woman who answered the phone said, our pharmacist is actually having her day off, but I'll give you her home phone number. That was what it was like back in the days when you just could hear, you know, the sense of need when somebody called you, and you did what you could to help. And so I got this recipe from this pharmacist on a day off in Brighton, and we mixed it up. It was a lipid that had to be mixed with the amphotericin. And so David lived longer because he had access to amphotericin. And what David taught us was that, you know, you don't say, you don't give up. When you say you want a better way, it is always possible to find one. And what we got was a method that could be used to treat other patients. The music that I wrote at this time is kind of complex. It was a portrait of David, who was a very witty, sophisticated man. He loved his jazz, I think. Well, he does in my piece. It's also a recollection of all the unrecognized, you know, effort and hours that the ASX team put into running underground trials. The piece ends with a long, quiet section, which contains a quote from Mozart. In one of Mozart's pieces. You know, Mozart was so talented, and he had so many melodies running through his mind that he would use one and kind of throw it away. You know, you find this gorgeous melody, and it wouldn't come back. And I remember listening to a tune like that and thinking, it needs to live longer. And I suppose I know why I would think such a thing, because I kept coming across people who needed to live longer. So I made it live longer in my piece. darkest just before dawn. We didn't know it, but we were on the brink of the protease inhibitors in 1994. But anybody can point to a year during the 1990s and say this was the worst year for AIDS. It would be different, I think, for everybody. But in a way, certainly the number of deaths kept increasing year after year. And in 1994, I suppose I consider that the worst year for me because that was the time that we in the AIDS Collective, kept hearing about the botched suicides. I can't imagine anything worse than deciding to end your life and not succeeding and waking up, possibly with a body even more damaged than before you tried. And why was this happening? It was because it's such a secretive thing that nobody talks about the best way to do it. So everybody relied on hearsay. It was illegal, of course, to get physician-assisted suicide. So people just made up ideas, passed on, recipes that may or may not have worked. And so we in the AIDS Collective decided to do something about it, and it became certainly the most blatantly illegal thing we ever did. We printed in our newsletter a recipe for how to do it. It was a recipe using potassium chloride, and we knew it worked because we had used it ourselves in our group. And that was the relief that I thought we could bring to the community at that very, very dark hour. I considered everybody who used the recipe to be a hero, someone who died in battle. In Greek mythology, there is a special place in the afterlife called Elysium. It's a place reserved by the gods for the very, very special heroes, those who died in battle. And I consider everybody who used that recipe to be one of them. And then it happened. The day that we had hoped for, but didn't dare to dream about, really. The day when the AIDS crisis could be considered over. The day arrived because these new drugs that we were trialing, the protease inhibitors, turned out to be a completely different class of drugs compared to everything else we had before. As my friend Jim Cody wrote to me one time in a fax, he said, "You got to see the data results. These drugs have the not just a possibility, but the absolute certainty to rescue people from the toilet." And so, with the dawn of the protease inhibitors, we were calling it the Lazarus effect. There were people who were at death's door, who could be turned around by the use of the protease inhibitors. And I finally contemplated that I could give up all my 6 years as an activist and return to what I was actually put on earth to do, which is to write music. The last piece that I wrote, right after I decided for myself that the AIDS crisis was over, and remember that everybody decided at a different time because they saw the results at different times, but because we were trying drugs so early in the piece, I knew that the crisis was over. And so we had our fairy tale ending. And as with any fairy tale, inside of a fairy tale is the promise of growing old. And these days, I give thanks that people can grow old. Every time I see a new gray hair on a friend's head or a new crease on a beautiful face, that's what I give thanks for, because there was a time when it just wasn't possible. So the music that I wrote at that time sounds to me like holiday songs, like Christmas songs from World War II. Like any war, there were soldiers that came back and those who didn't. And this piece is a tribute to them. Thank you so much. Normally the quartet goes off again and stays off stage, but we've been asked by SD if we would actually stay to answer questions because you might have some. So we'd be very, very happy to do that. Would you like us to do that? What's your name, sir? Alec. Thank you very much for saying that. It means a lot. One of the reasons I decided that it was time to finish all those sketches that I wrote back in the 90s into performable pieces of music was to be able to tell the stories of people who were heroes back then, whose names are not known today. We had this very gratifying moment when we performed it at the International AIDS Conference, and a young political candidate who was HIV positive said to me afterwards, "Now I know the names of the people who died so I can be alive today." So the gratitude that these people feel is all that we need to keep going, I think.
I just want to say that I think you put emotion to this very important part of history. I don't know, I've read about it in newspaper, read stories, obviously, over the years. They feel emotional because I didn't know anybody who was impacted by this. This brings the emotion home.
And as I said during the piece, you would have parallel stories here. I suppose, the experience that we had in Australia was identical to experiences in Toronto, Vancouver, certainly New York, San Francisco. Look for your heroes. Learn their names. I'm having trouble with the light, I'm sorry, they're in my eyes. So put your hands up really high. There you are. Go ahead.
How did you decide that a quartet was the way that you wanted to?
That is such an excellent question. It's got to do with something else altogether. When I was in Madison, Wisconsin, I studied with a world-famous pro-arte string quartet. This was a string quartet that was founded in Belgium in 1912, and they happened to be touring to Madison when World War II broke out. So the chancellor of the university stood up in the interval of the concert and said, "Hitler's invaded your home, you can't go home, but we'll make you a home here." So there, and under these strange circumstances, grew up this fabulous string playing tradition in Madison. And when I studied with them, it was a much later incarnation. It wasn't the same people who came from Belgium, but that tradition stayed. They would do things like play, entire concerts from memory. It was outrageous. And so the quartet was something very, very, it was very personal to me. It's also very personal to a lot of composers because, as any music historian will tell you, composers put their most intimate music into their quartets because they played for rooms like this, smaller rooms. You can say intimate things to a small group of people where you can see each of their faces. Whereas with symphony orchestras, they play to very, very large halls. It's much harder to say true and intimate things. So there's quartets of Beethoven, the quartets of Shostakovich are models of how intimate a composer can be. So for all of those reasons, I just fell into writing quartet music. I should say that these were simply sketches in the 1990s. I had no time to write fully composed pieces of music, what with coordinating funerals to make sure they weren't clashing. So it wasn't until about 20 years later. Something happened, 20 years after the epidemic ended. People started to write memoirs. There are a couple of fantastic documentaries about ACTA that came out in the last couple of years. I didn't know any of that was happening, but I just felt this time to put things down on paper. I mean, I want the story to outlive all of us. Stories with happy endings, stories that say this is what can be accomplished when people come together, when people really commit. I mean, the AIDS crisis is only over because, the patient community, the drug companies, and the government decided to put their differences aside to work together. It was really difficult. These were factions that were at war with each other most of the time. So that's a long answer to why string quartet.
On